Vidmori POV. To say that the inn was nice felt like an understatement. Or maybe it was just that I was so used to such low standards of living after decades of living through an apocalypse that I had forgotten what decent living was like. Even the sleeping areas I made for the people back at the Haven feels Spartan, when compared to the room at the inn I found myself staying at. I really should spend some time putting together a good collection of quality bedding, blankets and pillows to improve day-to-day living. The room was simple in regards to the layout. A single bed, a dresser, and a single suspended lamp. The lamp had a simple-looking crystal, instead of something like a candle, that would illuminate the room with a tap of a button on the wall by the door. The room was on the 3rd floor, and had an actual glass window that could be opened and closed, accompanied by a set of olive green curtains. The mattress itself was a relatively thin thing, stuffed with wool or perhaps some kind of cotton, and was then covered with clean grey sheets. It's a shame that I can't enjoy the experience of actually lying in bed. While I can tell it's soft, there's just an odd disconnect, where I can't feel the comfort or relief of getting off my feet and laying on my back. Though the cubs seemed to enjoy the bed, Basmori and Fraley kneading their claws into the mattress, while they audibly rumbled with delighted purring. The skins and furs they used to sleep on must seem like hard floors in comparison. Even Lugosi looked rather comfortable, as he lay on the bed behind them, sleeping soundly after the day of running he had gone through. The cubs, for their part, were resting near his belly on what free space remained on the mattress itself. The day was close to ending as far as I could tell, with the sun nearing the horizon, yet the streets were still active, with people going this way and that. I figured, now that I'm on my own, I might as well try to get some of my personal shopping done before most of the stores actually close for the day. Leaving Lugosi, Basmori and Fraley in my room, I made my way downstairs and came into a fairly busy dining area / lounge room, where a number of people ate and conversed. There was an eclectic variety of individuals in the room, with a number of various races being represented here. Colourful adventurers drinking loudly at the bar, caravan guards eagerly eating in groups clustered around large round tables, and a few hooded figures seemingly brooding in some odd corner, keeping to themselves as they quietly sipped at a drink or ate. Honestly, the fact that I may be the strangest one here, simply due to the fact that I'm a fancy wooden man who is actually a dungeon core from another world, is an odd feeling to come to terms with. As I pulled out my hood and made my way to leave the inn, I was actually stopped by the innkeeper's son, a strapping young man who was some kind of half-orc with tan skin. I couldn't remember his name, though he remembered mine, as he flashed a toothy grin. "Mr. Vito, will you be having dinner with us tonight?" I flashed a small smile as I looked down at him from under my hood. "Not tonight, no. I don't need to eat much after all," I mused, while slightly patting my stomach. "Though, if you could bring some meat up to my room, I'm sure my familiars will be happy to enjoy the treat." It's not like they needed to eat often either, but Lugosi worked hard today, and the cubs should still eat plenty to grow big and strong. They're docile and very well behaved, so don't worry about bothering them, I quickly added, as reassuringly as I could manage. I could sense him feeling vaguely nervous, as he recalls seeing Lugosi, but he just bobbed his head and gave me a thumbs up. "Understood. I'll see what I can put together," he enthused, before stepping away and tending to some other guests. Now that I'm free, I made my way out and just started walking. First things first, I need to look more like a regular person, so what that means is that I need to get some boots and gloves. Up till now, I've somehow managed to avoid outright touching anyone, or being directly touched, and nobody has really commented on how my footsteps sound like the clacking of wood on stone, rather than the thumps of meat on stone or wood. Though that might be thanks to how lightly I walk anyways. That will not last forever, so the sooner I have those things, the sooner I can better blend in. Taking a mental inventory of things, I have spent 4 silver on room and board for 2 nights at the inn. It was a nice room, and this looked like a nice part of town. Even with the apparent discount, I was likely staying at a place that had hotel rates, rather than motel ones. At the moment, I was left with a total of 7 silver pieces and 12 copper pieces, which didn't sound like a lot when I considered just how much I gave out to the sinners and Basti to make sure their potential expenses were covered. Thinking of the conversion rate for the currency of this continent, 30 copper equated 1 silver, and 15 silver equated 1 gold. There are apparently bigger coins, but I don't plan on handling them anytime soon. As for the coins themselves, copper pieces were no bigger than pennies, but they were strangely complex for something that looked stamped in mass production. Then again, they might just have some magic or advanced minting processes that help with that. The silver pieces themselves were around the size of nickels, and the gold pieces looked close to quarters to me. The coins also weren't straight up copper, silver or gold, but a thin blend of metals specifically minted into the various coin types, which reminded me of the way we did things back home. This likely aided in preventing people from melting the coins down, and helped against counterfeiting. I visited a cobbler first, and picked out a pair of ready-made brown boots that were close to my size. It was made with some kind of leather laces, which were used to adjust them to better fit around my calves, so they wouldn't slide off. I was moderately surprised to find that they offered a wide selection of socks that looked rather nicely made, but I didn't bother since it's not like I particularly needed them for comfort or health reasons. The boots were 18 copper pieces, so I ended up breaking a silver before moving on. From there, I found my way into a store that specializes in traveling equipment, after having visited 3 different general stores for a pair of good gloves. While I was vaguely surprised to find a specialized store like this, it was set up next to an armory, which catered to mercenaries and adventurers, so it was likely geared towards servicing their needs, which is probably why all the good gloves were here. While I initially came for just the gloves, all the other equipment just kept catching my eyes, and I ended up shopping around some more to help supplement my look. For a grand total of 4 silver pieces and 17 copper pieces, I ended up buying myself a pair of black leather gloves that went halfway up my forearm, a brown satchel that I slung over my shoulder so it sat on my hip like a messenger bag, a canvas tent with blankets, as well as a 50-foot bundle of rope and a pair of knives in case I needed to field dress anything. Lastly, I managed to set myself up with a leather belt that had a loop of leather that hung off my right hip, which allowed me to openly wear the falchion that Trisha made for me. I say openly, but I'm still concealing it with my cloak, but at the very least I don't look unarmed or underdressed anymore. By the time I was finished with my shopping, the sun was halfway down the horizon, filling the sky with an array of purple and orange hues. Now that I've spent money, I figured it was time to make some money. Well, I did spy a couple of pawn shops here and there, where I could possibly sell some of the junk armor I still had lying around in my storage, from the bandits all those weeks ago. I needed more money if I wanted to do even half the things I promised I would do for the Haven. Thankfully, I still had a ton of unprocessed ores that I could possibly sell to the Miners Guild around here. The only problem with that is that apparently the branch that deals with the miners is outside of the walls, but the main office is in the inner city where I'm at. Maybe if I go into the main office while still pretending to be an incognito powerful mage, I could get them to deal with me directly, instead of having to go out past the gates and risk being hassled if I want to come back in for the night. Miners Guild Guildmaster. Guildmaster Tilzim, POV. The Dwarven man sighed with frustration, looking at various reports and orders that were gradually starting to get backed up due to current circumstances. While most metal refinement and production went through unimpeded, they've been sorely lacking when it comes to meeting quotas for the Wolfram orders, ever since their Crucible Master fell ill. He was one of the only ones who could manage the intense flames needed to refine Wolfram in bulk to keep up with the demand for the metal in question. His assistants do well enough to keep things running without him, but they can only refine so much before their weaker mana hearts and mana rings get strained. Perhaps it is true that the guild rely too much on one man, so they'll certainly need to restructure, recruit, and train more guild members to harness fire magic as soon as possible, if they don't want this to happen again in the future. That is, if the Crucible Master ever recovers, which is looking doubtful with each passing day. Reaching for a bottle of something strong he had in a desk drawer, he's vaguely startled by a knock at the door to his office. Committing to grabbing the bottle, he also grabbed an iron cup and began to pour himself some barrel-aged bourbon. "Enter." In the next moment, he heard the latch turn as one of the receptionists stepped in. It was a Squirrelkin woman whose name was escaping him at the moment. "Excuse me, Guildmaster. Sorry to disturb you, but we have an odd client who is wishing to sell a lot of ore. He's not a miner and claims the ore doesn't come from the local mines. Due to how suspicious he is, I figured you ought to know," she explained, looking rather uncertain as her tail flicked anxiously behind her. Tilson just sighed tiredly, glancing at the window as he noted the sun's fading light on the horizon, taking a drink from his cup before gently setting it down. "He also came before we closed, while we had the least amount of traffic. Obviously we have some sort of amateur ore scalper, who likely came from a nearby territory. Could you do me a favor and start looking into reports from other guilds and see if there's a warrant out on this guy? In the meantime, take him to one of the waiting rooms and I'll see if I can't lure him into a trap, and get the guards to seize his cart." At that, the receptionist looked clearly relieved and bobbed her head eagerly. "You got it," she infused, before closing the door behind her and hurrying off. In the next 10 minutes, Tilson made his way to the waiting room, bottle in hand, as he took a swig from it before letting himself inside. He didn't really have it in him to be especially courteous and professional for a criminal, and if the suspicious guy really was a scalper, he'd likely be willing to put up with most things in order to make the sale. Looking around, he spotted a cloaked human man, in his late 30s, with a rather impressive air about him. His clothes didn't look like anything special, though they looked rather well made, yet he carried himself with an air of confidence Tilson wasn't expecting from an amateur scalper. As Tilson stepped into the room, the man turned to look as he regarded him with vibrant green eyes. For a second, Tilson felt as if his very soul was being measured, before the feeling faded as quickly as it went. For a second, he wondered if he was just being overly sensitive, or on edge as he brushed the feeling aside. "Sorry about the wait. You caught me at a bad time," he expressed with faux sincerity. In reality, he was just in no rush for this meeting, as he sat on one of the couches in the meeting room, gesturing for the man to sit across from him on the opposing couch. The man just flashed a smile as he moved to take a seat, brushing his cloak back and settling in comfortably. Though Tilson noted the empty loop that hung off the man's right hip, vaguely surprised that the man would seemingly come to this meeting unarmed, considering the circumstances. "It's no problem, Guildmaster. It's my fault for coming in without an appointment, though I'm grateful you are seeing me despite the circumstances." Tilson just mentally facepalms. Of course. He could have just had the guy wait until tomorrow. Then again, he might have tried to sell the ore elsewhere if he had trouble getting rid of it. He took another swig from the bottle before just smiling a bit as he shrugged. "What can I say? You caught me in a generous mood, despite the circumstances," he parroted, setting the bottle down on the table between them before leaning back against the couch. "So, how much ore are you trying to offload, and what kinds?" he asked bluntly now, making it easier for the human to make the deal without dancing around the topic too much. The man reached into his cloak, and despite it being bunched up over his shoulder, he pulled out a hefty chunk of cleaned iron ore that couldn't have possibly been in the cloak a moment ago. It was as the man set the iron ore down on the table that Tilson realized he may not be dealing with an amateur at all. "Well, I know from the receptionist that you're buying iron ore at 4 copper a pound, but I need more than that," he said simply, before leaning back in his seat. Tilson couldn't help but feel a shudder travelling down his spine, his hand clenching his bottle, as he realised that he was the one who was trapped here. He may have a decent man of heart and be a capable fighter, but he's definitely not armed, and likely wouldn't be able to outrun this guy if something happened. He took a swig of the bourbon before narrowing his gaze at the human across from him. "And? How much do you want?" The man flashed a small smile, as he gestured at the iron ore between them. "Give me 9 copper per pound and I'll refine it all for you. No waste, minimal impurities," he offered, as he seemed to relax even more. Tilsim opened his mouth to call the man a crook, a cheat, and yet, that actually sounded reasonable. Not even that bad of an offer, if the human handled all the labour and could actually guarantee that sort of quality. In fact, he was now having a hard time finding something to disagree with, beyond the fact that these ores were all likely all stolen from somewhere. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" the man asked almost teasingly, as he smirked with amusement. "Or is it the fact that you think I've stolen all these ores or something?" At that, Tilsim tensed again, as he eyed the man warily again, but before he could say anything, the man continued. "Oh, come on now, it was obvious. As soon as I mentioned just how much ore I was planning on selling, that receptionist got all squirrely." The man then shrugged a bit. "You won't find any records for this ore, though. It's from my own private mine," he explained rather nonchalantly. "I haven't needed money in the last decade or so, but now that I'm travelling again, I need a little spending power. You can help me with that, right?" Tilsim was starting to get more and more of a feeling that this guy probably wasn't just some scalper. Doing his best to remain calm, he took another swig of bourbon before sitting up and looking the human over more intently. "How much ore are you trying to sell?" The human looked thoughtful before just shrugging a bit. "Well, I initially only planned on selling 50 pounds, to keep things relatively tame. But I think I'll sell 100 pounds. Do you think you can handle that much?" Well, of course he could. They process close to that on a regular basis. There were 100 pounds of already refined iron? "How long until you have the iron ready?" The human hummed for a moment before smiling. "Show me a standard ingot and I'll see what I can do." Something about that smile unnerved Tilsim, and if he didn't realize that the human wasn't in a good mood before now, he was definitely sure he was pretty pissed about being treated like some kind of criminal. I see. Give me a moment," he said quietly as he stood, making his way to the doors of the waiting room, only to be greeted by a squad of guardsmen, being led by the Squirrelkin receptionist, who was looking rather worried. "Guildmaster, I couldn't find anything on the reported scalpers, but I got the guards here all ready to take care of him," she explained, as her fluffy tail wiggled frantically. The guardsmen looked at the Guildmaster expectantly. They weren't here for a fight, just to arrest some thieving scalper, but that was not the situation anymore, not by a long shot, as he stared wide-eyed, and choked on his response at first. Glancing back in the room at the human, he seemed as calm as could be despite the amount of manpower gathered here. He finally cleared his throat a bit and looked up to the guards. "Thank you all for making the trip, but this has all been a big misunderstanding, Mr. Tilsim started to say, realizing he hadn't even gotten the human's name before now, as he glanced behind him again. The human just smiled a bit as he leaned forward on the seat, resting his elbows on his knees. "John Smythe," he said simply. Right. Mr. Smythe is a legitimate businessman. There's no trouble here," he expressed to the guards, before he then looked over to the Squirrelkin receptionist and cleared his throat a little more. Could you fetch Mr. Smythe an iron ingot? He would like to have an example of the processed material." The guards did look a little confused for their part, but they weren't about to argue with an influential man like the Miners' Guild Guildmaster. If he said things were all right, then they were all right. In short order, they filed out and left the Guildhall, while the Squirrelkin woman rushed off to do as asked. As Tilsim looked back at Mr. Smythe, he offered a rather sheepish smile as he ran his fingers through his beard in an attempt to help calm himself. Sorry about her. She tends to get excited over the littlest of things. I truly hope you found no offense. The human merely shrugged again as he smiled, leaning back into his seat. It's fine. I know I'm an odd one, that's for sure. That reminds me, I remember a group of teens calling me a travelling eccentric. I suppose that is a rather fitting descriptor. And there it was. The answer to the growing feeling of unease that the Bourbon wasn't settling. An eccentric in his guild? It's only by the grace of the gods that he hasn't crossed whatever line this man has drawn in the sand. Swallowing to himself, he set the bottle of Bourbon down and approached a cabinet as he procured a bottle with a liquid as black as shadow, before glancing over to Mr. Smythe. Sir, would you perhaps enjoy a drink with me while we wait? He offered out of genuine sincerity, as he grabbed 2 crystal glasses and uncorked the bottle. It's ever black, a rather potent brew, he explained with a dejected little shrug. This was the only thing that could possibly help him keep his nerves now. The human smiled a little more, starting to shake his head before looking thoughtful. You know what? Sure. Make mine a triple. Tilson tensed again, though more out of shock than anything, as he just finished pouring himself a double that he intended on nursing. Though he wasn't about to argue with an eccentric as he poured the man a triple and brought over the glasses, setting one down in front of the man, on the table, before taking his own place back on the couch. The human eyed the drink curiously before licking his lips a little, taking up the crystal glass and swelling its contents. Though in the next moment he downed the whole thing, tilting his head all the way back as he emptied the glass before setting it back down. He hummed seemingly in delight before sighing heavily as a small spout of flame spewed from his mouth. This seemed to amuse him even more as he chuckled to himself. Tilsom now couldn't help but wonder if Mr. Smythe is even a human at all, nursing the black brew as he sighed a little more. After a long few minutes, the receptionist finally returned with the ingot in hand, much to Tilson's relief, as she held it out to him. Though at that, he merely shook his head and suddenly gestured for her to give it to Mr. Smythe. Which he did, rather cheerfully in fact, as she apparently took Tilsom's reassurances that Mr. Smythe was actually a businessman. Thank you, the human mentioned fairly cheerfully, as he took up the ingot and looked it over, twirling it around in his hand, when it suddenly disappeared into thin air. Tilson couldn't quite believe his eyes, and wasn't sure if it was a sleight of hand or magic. But then he didn't even see a spell being cast. The human then reached out to the Squirrelkin receptionist, before seemingly pulling the ingot out from behind her ear, as she chuckled a little more. Thank you for your help. Sorry about scaring you earlier, he offered rather sincerely. The receptionist, for her part, looked clearly amazed, as she kept looking between Tilsom and the ingot of iron, rather before looking at Mr. Smythe and flashing a warm smile. It's okay, Mr. Smythe. I apologize for thinking you were a criminal, she said rather bluntly, lowering her head a little before looking back to Tilsom again. If you'll excuse me, Guildmaster, I must get back to my closing duties. With that, she made her way out of the meeting room, excitedly waving her goodbyes to Mr. Smythe, before stepping out of sight. Before Tilsom could ask Mr. Smythe how long it'll take for the ingots to be ready again, the human stood and pulled the coffee table away from between them. He then took a knee before holding out his hand and closing his eyes. Tilsom watched on curiously, and as he took the time to try and find the words to ask what was happening, he suddenly realized that ingot after ingot of iron was suddenly appearing out of thin air, being neatly stacked up in a sort of pyramid, until all 100 pounds of iron was standing between them. Once again, Tilsom was lost for words as he opened and closed his mouth a few times, setting his glass of Everblack to the side, before reaching out to touch the ingots themselves. By the gods, they're still warm. He looked between the metal ingots and Mr. Smythe, a brilliant little idea forming in his mind, as he finally flashed the first confident smile he could muster this whole conversation. Are you available for hire?